The Odyssey shrieked like a dying animal, its metal frame twisting and groaning under the sheer force of its uncontrolled descent. Inside the cockpit, Commander Will Watson fought against the pull of gravity and chaos, his body straining against his harness as the ship tumbled violently through the void. His ice-blue eyes darted between the cockpit's displays, flashing red warning lights, failing thruster readouts, and the worst of all, a cracked viewport revealing the merciless world below. A frozen planet. Jagged ice peaks pierced the storm-choked sky like the fangs of some ancient beast. The land below was a wasteland of endless white, a churning maelstrom of wind and snow that swallowed all light and life. The Odyssey wasn't landing. It was plummeting straight into oblivion. A violent shudder rocked the ship as another system gave out. "Come on. Hold together, damn it," Will growled, his fingers digging into the controls with sheer force. The Odyssey's thrusters coughed, sputtered, and died. The ship spun faster, spiraling toward the surface. The G-forces crushed against him, pressing him into his seat, his vision blurring at the edges. He could barely hear the alarms anymore, just a high-pitched ringing in his ears, the sound of impending death. His suit's display flickered with desperate warnings. Primary power, offline. Stabilizers, offline. Structural integrity, critical. Survival odds, 3%. He gritted his teeth. 3% was still a chance. Will yanked the emergency thruster override. The ship lurched, engines coughing as a final burst of energy slowed the descent just enough to change the angle of impact. But not enough to stop it. The Odyssey smashed into the frozen earth with a catastrophic explosion of ice and metal. The world became a blur of white. The ship tore through the ice, plowing a deep trench as it skidded across the surface like a meteorite hitting an ocean of snow. Metal screamed, bulkheads buckled, and inside, Will was whipped forward, his harness digging into his ribs with bruising force. Then, silence. A thick, suffocating silence. For a moment, Will didn't move. Pain pulsed through his body, a sharp ache in his shoulder, a dull throb in his ribs, the sting of something warm trickling down his temple. His breath came in ragged gasps, forming wisps of mist in the freezing air. The dim emergency lights flickered, casting the ruined cockpit in a haunting red glow. Sparks rained from exposed wires, and somewhere deep within the ship, a pipe hissed steam into the frigid air. Will exhaled slowly. He was alive. But for how long? He reached up with shaking fingers, pressing on his wrist module. The cracked screen flickered to life, showing his current status. Oxygen levels, 10%. Internal temperature, critical. Heating system, offline. Structural damage, severe. His jaw tightened. Not good. Not good at all. With effort, he unbuckled his harness and stumbled to his feet. His boots crunched against the frozen metal floor, every step sending a fresh stab of pain through his bruised muscles. Through the fractured viewport, he could see the storm still raging outside. The wind howled across the barren landscape, ghostly tendrils of ice and snow swirling like the spirits of the damned. No lights. No settlements. No signs of life. Just endless white. His mind raced. His ship was wrecked. His systems were failing. If he stayed inside, he'd freeze to death. If he went outside, the storm would devour him whole. Will exhaled sharply, rolling his shoulders against the pain. There had to be a way out. There always was. He pressed a button on his wrist module, activating his suit's last remaining power reserves. A dim blue light flickered to life along his arm, barely strong enough to provide warmth. Not enough. His teeth clenched. He needed a plan. And fast. Outside, the wind shrieked against the hull, as if the storm itself was mocking his struggle. Will glared at the swirling darkness beyond the glass, his breath curling into mist. How the hell do I get out of this frozen hellhole? Survival mode activated. Will forced down the rising panic clawing at the edges of his mind. He was a pilot, a soldier, a survivor. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. Action. Movement. Survival. That's all that mattered now. With a sharp inhale, he turned back to the ruined Odyssey, its once proud frame now a mangled wreck buried in ice and debris. Smoke curled weakly from the impact site, its dark tendrils barely visible against the howling whiteout. The hull groaned under the weight of the frozen winds, as if the ship itself were gasping for breath. Will climbed through the wreckage, pushing aside broken panels and exposed wiring until he reached a reinforced storage compartment. His fingers moved on instinct, punching in the override code. A hiss of pressurized air escaped as the door slid open, revealing his lifeline, the X-42 Recon exosuit. Sleek. Deadly. Built for hellscapes exactly like this. The suit's titanium plating gleamed with a faint blue pulse, its nanofiber mesh adapting to his movements the moment he slipped into it. A low hum vibrated against his skin as the thermal regulators engaged, flooding his limbs with welcome warmth. A HUD flickered to life inside his visor. Temperature, -75 degrees Celsius, hostile. Visibility, 20%, severe storm interference. Oxygen reserves, 9%, dangerously low. Will exhaled through gritted teeth. All right, let's do this. With a final glance at his crippled ship, he pushed open the emergency hatch and stepped into the frozen wasteland. The wind hit him like a goddamn freight train. The cold was unlike anything he had ever experienced, razor sharp, vicious, seeping into bone even through the suit's insulation. The blizzard shrieked through jagged ice formations, twisting and howling like some ancient, restless beast. Everywhere, the landscape was both breathtaking and brutal. Towering spires of translucent ice clawed toward the sky, their surfaces shimmering under the weak, ashen glow of a dying sun. The ground beneath his boots was fractured, unstable, riddled with deep fissures that seemed to drop into endless voids. Will moved cautiously, scanning his surroundings. The storm made visibility a nightmare, phantoms of ice and shadow dancing in his periphery. Every step crunched loudly in the otherwise hollow silence. Then movement. A flicker in the snowstorm. His hand shot instinctively to his pulse pistol, fingers curling around the grip as his visor's AI-enhanced scanners flickered into focus. A silhouette emerged from the storm, 20 meters ahead. At first, she was just a dark shape against the blinding white. Then the wind shifted, and he saw her. Will's breath hitched. She was unlike anything he had ever encountered. 7 feet tall, her presence was both regal and lethal, the kind of effortless power that didn't need to be announced, it was simply felt. Her emerald armor gleamed, pulsing with glowing cyan veins of energy that seemed to shift and ripple as if the suit itself were alive. Her long silver hair whipped violently in the wind, framing a face that was both sharp and hauntingly beautiful. But it was her eyes that pinned him in place. Piercing gold. Burning like twin suns. She moved like a predator, not rushing, not hesitating, just calculated precision in every step. Then she spoke. And even through the roar of the storm, her voice cut through sharp as the cold itself. "Who are you, intruder?" A command, not a question. Will tilted his head slightly, his lips twitching into a smirk. Exhausted. Stranded. freezing his ass off. But still very much himself. "Will Watson," he answered, his voice steady despite the odds stacked against him. "Commander of the ship that just crash-landed in your backyard." A beat of silence. Then he added, with that signature cocky edge. "And you?" "The landlord." A flicker of something passed through her golden gaze. Not anger. Not amusement. Something else. Curiosity. Assessment. Will held her stare, his pulse pistol still half raised, though they both knew if she wanted him dead, he wouldn't have even heard the shot. The storm howled between them, the world hanging in perfect stillness. This wasn't just a first encounter. It was a collision of two forces, two warriors, measuring each other in the midst of an unforgiving wasteland. And Will had the distinct feeling that his troubles were only just beginning. The wind shrieked, a sudden, brutal force that sent razor-sharp ice particles slicing through the air. Some struck Will's exosuit, leaving faint, silvery scratches on the titanium plating. Others cut through the exposed parts of his face, stinging like 1,000 tiny blades. He barely flinched. Instead, he stood his ground, legs braced against the howling storm, arms crossed over his chest, his posture deliberately unshaken. "I didn't come here looking for a fight," he said, voice steady, edged with a quiet warning. "But if you're itching for one, I won't disappoint." Aurelia tilted her head slightly. The motion was almost amused. Then, she took a single step forward. Despite the treacherous ice beneath her, she didn't slip, didn't waver. There was something unnatural about the way she moved, too smooth, too effortless. The sharp gusts of wind should have sent her cloak billowing wildly, but instead, the heavy fabric only rippled slightly, as if bound to her presence. Will's eyes flicked down. No footprints. Not even a trace of her steps on the frost-covered ground. His pulse quickened. She wasn't just strong. She was something else. Something beyond the limits of what he knew. Aurelia's golden eyes roamed over him, not just looking, but dissecting. Taking in every inch of him. The battered boots. The scorched plating on his exosuit. The sharp defiance in his stance. She exhaled softly, the faintest trace of a smirk at the corner of her lips. "You are different." Will raised an eyebrow. "I like to think I'm a little more interesting than the average guy." Aurelia didn't respond. Instead, she turned her gaze past him, her expression shifting, lips pressing into a thin, unreadable line. Something was wrong. Will's instincts flared. Then the world roared. A sound so deep, so raw, it wasn't just heard, it was felt. The storm had become a living thing. Will spun around just in time to see it, a blinding wall of ice and snow, barreling toward them like an avalanche given life. The wind had become a howling monster, twisting in chaotic fury. Towering shards of ice were lifted into the air, spinning violently before being hurled forward like spears. The ground shuddered beneath his boots, cracks spider-webbing outward as the frozen earth threatened to split apart. This wasn't a normal storm. Will's breath came fast. He had seen blizzards before, but not like this. Not alive. Aurelia's voice cut through the chaos, sharp, unwavering. "Follow me if you want to live." No hesitation. No arrogance. Just cold certainty. Will's fingers twitched near his plasma pistol. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. But survival? Non-negotiable. His decision took less than a heartbeat. He exhaled sharply. "Lead the way." Aurelia turned without another word, moving with the same ghostly grace as before. Will followed, but his instincts screamed at him to keep his hand near his weapon. Whatever lay ahead, he wasn't about to let his guard down. The storm was a howling demon, tearing through the frozen wasteland with unrelenting fury. Jagged spears of ice rained from the sky, shattering on impact, sending shards flying in all directions. Will's muscles burned as he sprinted through the knee-deep snow, his breath coming in sharp, misty gasps. Just ahead, a dark opening, a cave, barely visible through the blinding whiteout. A roar tore through the storm. The wind screamed, lifting sheets of snow like a tidal wave, threatening to bury them alive. Move. Aurelia's voice cut through the chaos. A deep crevice yawned before them, splitting the ice-covered ground like a wound. Will didn't hesitate. He leapt. For a split second, he was airborne, the abyss gaping below him silent, endless. Then impact. His boots crunched against solid ice, knees bending to absorb the shock. A second later, Aurelia followed. But as she landed, her foot slipped. Her balance wavered, the icy surface betraying her. Will saw it happen in slow motion, her powerful frame twisting, gravity pulling her toward the abyss. Without thinking, he lunged. His fingers snapped around her wrist, gripping tightly. Aurelia's golden eyes flared, startled. For a breathless moment, they were locked together at the edge of oblivion. Will, straining to pull her up, Aurelia's weight dragging against him. The storm raged around them, oblivious to the precariousness of their fate. Then, with a sharp exhale, she steadied herself, gripping his forearm. Together, they pulled. The ice groaned beneath them. One final heave, and Aurelia was back on solid ground. For a second, neither of them moved. Their faces were inches apart, gold and blue, breath mingling in the freezing air. Then, just as quickly, she straightened, pulling away. No words were spoken. None were needed. Will felt something shift, something unspoken, unmeasured. They stumbled into the cave just as the storm slammed into the mountainside. A deafening boom shook the earth. Snow and ice collapsed over the entrance, sealing them inside. Darkness swallowed them whole. The silence was almost worse than the storm. Will's breathing was heavy, mist curling from his lips in the frigid air. The only sounds were the faint hum of his suit and the quiet crackle of ice shifting above them. His wrist module flickered to life. Oxygen reserves, low. Heat levels, stable for now. He exhaled through his nose. Not great. Aurelia sat gracefully on a smooth rock, her golden eyes watching him. The sharp hostility from before had softened, replaced with something closer to curiosity. "You're not afraid of me," she stated, her voice quieter than before. It wasn't a challenge this time. It was an observation. Will smirked, adjusting a loose strap on his suit. "I've faced worse." Aurelia arched an elegant silver brow. "Worse?" Will leaned back against the icy wall, arms crossed. "Ever seen a cybernetic dragon that eats starships for fuel?" "Because I had a real up-close encounter with one near Vega 9. A pause. Then, surprisingly, a soft chuckle. Aurelia laughed. It was a brief sound, barely more than a breath. But it was real. Will grinned. "What? You don't believe me?" Aurelia's eyes glinted. "I believe you survived. Whether that was skill or sheer human recklessness, I have yet to decide." Will huffed a short laugh. "You'd be surprised how often those two go hand in hand." Before she could respond, a deep boom shook the cavern. The ceiling trembled. With a deafening crack, a massive slab of ice broke loose, crashing to the ground. The entrance was gone. A cloud of frozen mist swirled around them, tiny shards of ice catching the dim blue glow of Will's suit. Will coughed, waving away the fine particles dusting his visor. When the air cleared, he turned to Aurelia with a dry smirk. "Welcome to my life." Aurelia's lips parted, not quite a smile, but something close. Their eyes met, held for just a second longer than necessary. In the cramped space, with nothing but cold air and the weight of silence pressing in, the distance between them suddenly felt smaller. The cave had become its own universe, cut off from the chaos outside, sealed beneath an unbreakable wall of ice and stone. The air was thick with silence, the only sound the distant drip of melting frost echoing through the cavern's crystalline depths. The dim glow of Will's armor pulsed softly, casting ghostly shadows along the jagged walls. But in the near darkness, Aurelia was the only thing that stood out, vivid, unmistakable. Bioluminescent veins pulsed beneath her armor, threading through the emerald plating like liquid starlight. The faint cyan glow accentuated the sharp lines of her face, high cheekbones, fierce eyes, lips set in quiet contemplation. Her silver hair shimmered, strands catching the soft luminescence of the cavern. Will studied her in silence. She was unlike anything he had encountered before, not just in form, but in presence. There was something intoxicating about her. The air around her carried a scent unlike anything in his databanks, a contradiction of frozen tundra and molten metal. Aurelia took a step forward. The atmosphere shifted. Will felt it, the sudden collapse of distance, the tension coiling between them. His pulse quickened, but not from fear. He exhaled sharply, his breath misting in the frigid air. "You're not like anyone I've ever met." His voice was low, steady, but there was an edge to it, something raw beneath the surface. Aurelia didn't answer. She just watched him, golden irises burning like twin suns against the frozen backdrop. For the first time, Will found himself wondering who, or what, she really was. Frowning, he tapped a control on his wrist. His suit's bioscanner hummed to life, casting a soft blue light that swept over her. Data flickered onto his visor. Heart rate, elevated. Cellular structure, hybridized. DNA composition, partially organic, partially unknown. Will's jaw tensed. "You're not entirely Salarian, are you?" Aurelia's expression didn't shift. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. But something in her eyes, a flicker of hesitation, of guarded truth, was answer enough. The silence between them grew heavier. Charged. Will took a slow breath. The air between them had changed. It was no longer just caution. No longer just curiosity. It was something deeper. Something unspoken. As if drawn by some invisible force, Will stepped closer. His hand lifted, hesitant at first, before his fingers brushed against her shoulder. The cool, metallic surface of her armor met his touch. But where the plating parted, his fingertips found warmth. The soft curve of bare skin. A faint, almost imperceptible shiver ran through her. Aurelia did not move away. Instead, her breath hitched just slightly, a break so small that anyone else might have missed it. Will didn't. His fingers traced the edge of a glowing bioluminescent marking on her collarbone. It pulsed beneath his touch, reactive, alive, like the heartbeat of a star. And then instinct took over. Their lips met. Swift. Fierce. Unrelenting. It wasn't tentative. It wasn't careful. It was a collision, fire against ice, heat meeting cold. Aurelia responded instantly. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. Her hands gripped his suit, pulling him closer. The kiss was a battle, a struggle for control. Neither of them wanted to surrender. For a moment, the freezing world around them ceased to exist. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, it ended. They broke apart, breathless, mist curling between them. Will's heartbeat pounded in his ears. His mind raced with questions, with confusion, with the undeniable certainty that something irreversible had just happened. Aurelia's golden eyes locked onto his. Something had shifted. The lines between wariness and desire, curiosity and connection, had begun to blur. And in the confined space of the cave, surrounded by the weight of the unknown, there was no turning back. The night passed in a tense, fragile stillness. The cave was silent except for the occasional distant crack of shifting ice, a low, haunting sound that reminded them both of the fragile sanctuary they had taken. The dim glow from Will's armor flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows along the jagged crystalline walls. They sat close not out of necessity, but because something had changed between them. Their touches were light, hesitant fingertips brushing, quiet whispers exchanged in the cold air. The heat of their breath mingled, a fleeting contrast to the frozen world around them. Nothing more. And yet, the space between them felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. Aurelia had not spoken much since the kiss, but she had not pulled away either. There was an unspoken understanding. But as the pale light of a distant sun filtered through a crack in the rock, the fragile calm shattered. Aurelia stiffened. Her body tensed as if struck by an unseen force. Her breath hitched, sharp and shallow. Then, with a sudden, choked gasp, her hand clutched her abdomen. Will was on alert instantly. "Aurelia." His voice cut through the still air, his posture shifting from guarded to concerned in an instant. She didn't answer at first. Her golden eyes darkened, clouded with something he had never seen before. Her fingers dug into her side, as if trying to suppress an invisible pain. Then she whispered, "Something's wrong." Her voice was unsteady. Not with fear but with uncertainty. Will's instincts kicked in. He moved fast, tapping a command on his wrist console. His bioscanner hummed to life, sweeping over her body. The results flashed across his visor. Foreign embryo detected. Growth rate, exponential. Will's stomach tightened. His breath came out in a sharp exhale. Impossible. His grip on the scanner tightened. His mind raced, struggling to process the data. An embryo? Already growing? He looked at her. Aurelia, the warrior. The enigma. The woman who was supposed to be untouchable, strong, unwavering, Salarian. Now, she looked vulnerable. She opened her mouth to speak, but before a single word could leave her lips, the world exploded. A deafening detonation rocked the cave. The impact was sudden, brutal, like a planetary collision. The walls trembled violently, sending jagged cracks splintering across the icy ceiling. Then a cascade of rock and ice collapsed from above, crashing around them. Will barely had time to react before a massive chunk of debris slammed into the ground between them, throwing up a blinding cloud of frost and dust. He coughed, waving away the frozen mist. Aurelia. A shape emerged from the swirling haze. Aurelia, struggling to her feet, one hand still pressed to her side. But before he could reach her, another shockwave tore through the cavern. A deep, guttural rumble echoed through the cave, something unnatural, something alive. The walls weren't just collapsing. They were reacting. The air shifted. Will's tactical visor flickered, scanning the surroundings. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a cave-in. Something had caused it. Someone. But there was no time to think. No time to question. A massive boulder crashed down, blocking their only known exit. Will clenched his jaw. No. Not like this. We need to move now. His voice was firm, cutting through the chaos. He lunged toward Aurelia, grabbing her arm, steadying her as more debris rained down. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs, but his grip was steady. She met his gaze, her golden eyes flashing with something unreadable, a mix of pain, determination, and something deeper. Will turned to the rock ceiling, their only escape route. His muscles tensed. He planted his feet, bracing himself against the ice-slick ground. Then he shoved. The boulder groaned under the strain, but it did not move. Gritting his teeth, Will pressed harder. His armor whined in protest, servos straining under the force. Come on. Come on. Aurelia moved beside him. She pressed her hands against the rock, summoning strength from somewhere deep within. The bioluminescent markings on her skin flared brighter, pulsing in sync with her heartbeat. For a split second, Will swore he could feel it, something raw, something unnatural, coiling beneath her skin. Then, with a final, desperate heave, the rock gave way. A blinding wave of icy daylight crashed into the cave, outlining Will's face, his jaw set, his eyes burning with relentless determination. He turned back to Aurelia, reaching for her. We get out of here. His voice was steady, but beneath it, questions burned like wildfire. He needed answers. And somehow, he knew this was just the beginning. The earthquake of destruction roared behind them. Ice shattered. Rocks groaned. The cave's death rattle echoed through the passage, a final, vengeful fury determined to bury them alive. But Will didn't stop. He sprinted through the narrowing corridor, his boots hammering against the ice, the weight of his armor barely slowing him. Aurelia was beside him, her movements swift and precise, even as exhaustion dragged at her body. A deafening crack split the air. Ahead a massive boulder came crashing down, sealing their path. Will's mind calculated options in a fraction of a second. Left dead end. Right unstable wall. Up no time. Straight through. He clenched his jaw. Not today. Summoning every ounce of strength his exosuit could muster, he charged forward. The impact shook his bones. His armor's servos screamed in protest, steel plating groaning under the strain. The boulder shifted just enough. One more shove. Will let out a raw, guttural growl as he threw his full force against the obstruction. The ice cracked, splintering apart in a jagged, deafening explosion. And then they broke free. They stumbled into the open tundra, gasping for breath. The frigid wind howled against them, razor-sharp and merciless as 1,000 blades. Snow swirled in violent eddies, clinging to their armor, their skin. Above them, the sky stretched out an endless, pale gray abyss. No sun, no warmth. Just an empty, frozen wasteland as far as the eye could see. Aurelia hunched over, her breath heavy, her hand trembling as it pressed against her abdomen. Will's sharp gaze locked onto her. Something was wrong. She stood there, silent, unmoving. A realization settling over her like a slow-moving storm. Then she whispered, barely audible over the wind. The child, it's real. Will's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. His mind raced, trying to grasp the impossible. He had survived shipwrecks, orbital bombardments, and dogfights against warlords. He had faced things that defied nature, technology, and logic itself. But this was something else entirely. A foreign, unfamiliar feeling gripped his chest, not fear, not shock, but something deeper. He stepped closer, his breath visible in the frozen air. His voice, steady but heavy with meaning. Then we face this together. Aurelia straightened at his words. Her usual defiant strength remained, but something beneath it had shifted: acceptance. Understanding. Her golden eyes burned not with doubt, but with fire. It is a part of me, she said, her voice unshaken. Then, after a breath, her gaze locked onto his. And a part of you. The words hung between them, heavier than the sky above. This was no longer just about survival. It was something far greater. Their fates had been bound together by something beyond their control, beyond war, beyond history, beyond reason. Perhaps, by destiny itself. The icy silence shattered. A deep, guttural roar sliced through the howling wind, rolling across the frozen wasteland like the war cry of a coming storm. Will's head snapped up. Through the blinding wall of snow, shadows emerged. Salarian warships. Sleek. Predatory. Their hulls shifted like liquid metal, adapting to the shifting storm as they descended toward the frozen plains. The ominous hum of their engines vibrated through the ground, a promise of war written in fire and steel. Aurelia stood motionless beside him, her golden eyes locked onto the approaching vessels. They're here for me. Her voice was steady, calm, even. But Will wasn't fooled. Beneath that regal composure, something else simmered. Resolve. And perhaps, the faintest trace of regret. She reached into her armor, her fingers slipping beneath the layered plating. When she withdrew her hand, she held something small, a glowing green crystal. It pulsed softly, alive in a way Will couldn't explain. Without hesitation, she pressed it into his palm. The moment it touched his skin, a wave of warmth spread through his fingers, a stark contrast to the frozen wind that gnawed at his flesh. Use this to find me if you must. Her gaze locked onto his, unyielding. Will looked down at the crystal. It throbbed in his hand, a rhythmic pulse, almost like a heartbeat. His grip tightened around it. And if I do? Aurelia's lips curled into the ghost of a smile. But she didn't answer. Instead, she turned toward the descending warships, her silver hair whipping wildly in the storm. For a brief moment, she hesitated. Then without another word she walked away. Will watched as her figure faded into the blinding snow, swallowed by destiny itself. A final farewell. For a long moment, he stood there, unmoving. His breath curled into the frozen air, the crystal in his palm pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Then, a distant explosion. His head snapped toward the horizon. A fiery bloom erupted in the distance. The settlement. Will's pulse kicked into overdrive. The Salarian fleet wasn't just here for Aurelia. War had already begun. A sharp crack of gunfire split the air. Then another. The distant echoes of screams and chaos bled through the wind. With one last look at the vanishing figure of Aurelia, Will turned and sprinted toward the human outpost. The battle was no longer coming. It was already here. The human encampment was a fortress built from desperation, steel, tarp, and hope stretched to its limits. Will strode through the icy pathways, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. The air reeked of gunpowder, burning metal, and sweat. Overhead, thick plumes of smoke coiled into the darkened sky, staining the atmosphere with the grim reality of war. Explosions rumbled in the distance, shaking the earth beneath his feet. Everywhere, soldiers moved with frantic urgency, barking orders, dragging crates of ammunition, fortifying makeshift barricades with whatever scrap they could scavenge. The settlement wasn't ready. And Will knew it. "Watson. You're alive." A voice cut through the chaos. Will turned just in time to see a young officer barreling toward him, blonde hair damp with sweat and grime. "Lieutenant Harris." Before Will could respond, Harris clapped him on the back, gripping his arm and dragging him toward the command tent. Inside, the air was thick with tension. A large steel table dominated the center, holographic maps flickering above it, blue-lit projections of terrain, strategic positions, and incoming enemy movements. A cluster of high-ranking officers stood around the display, engaged in a hushed but heated debate. Their eyes darted between the projections and the live feed of the Salarian fleet hovering above them like a silent executioner. A shadow moved at the far end of the tent. General Briggs. A grizzled war veteran, his face lined with scars and sleepless nights. His steel-gray eyes locked onto Will the moment he entered. "The Salarian Empire is fracturing," Briggs said, voice low, grave. "One faction, Aurelia's loyalists, want peace." His fingers tightened into a fist. "But the other?" He turned toward the flickering holographic map. A crimson marker pulsed like a heartbeat. "Led by High Commander Pyrrhus, is calling for total human extermination." Silence settled over the room like a cold death shroud. Then, a sharp beep pierced the air. The main display flickered violently, the static resolving into the scarred face of High Commander Pyrrhus. His ashen skin stretched tight over sharp bone. His glowing red eyes burned with venomous hatred. His voice was a snarl of contempt. "The alien defiler has tainted our queen." Pyrrhus's rage was palpable, crackling through the speakers like a storm waiting to break. His skeletal hand slammed against the console in front of him, shaking the feed. "His very existence is an insult to the Salarian bloodline." His breath hissed through sharpened teeth. "Surrender him!" His voice dipped to something almost inhuman, seething with unholy fury. "Or your kind will be erased from this world." The threat hung in the air, thick as smoke. Every officer in the room turned toward Will. "Waiting." Will exhaled slowly. Then, he smirked. "Well." He leaned against the table, arms crossed, completely unfazed. "I guess he's not a fan of mine." A pause. Then, without missing a beat, "Somebody get this guy an iced tea before he bursts a blood vessel." A single, heavy silence followed. Then Harris snorted. One of the officers coughed to stifle a laugh. Briggs, however, did not smile. His voice cut through the moment like a blade through flesh. "We don't have time for jokes, Watson." His stare was steel. "Pyrrhus isn't bluffing." Will's smirk faded. The war had officially begun. The command room was thick with tension, the air almost suffocating with anticipation. Then, a sharp, piercing chime echoed through the chamber. The static-filled holographic screen crackled to life, its distorted lines stabilizing into a crystal-clear image. A figure stood at the center of the projection. Aurelia. She was aboard a small Salarian vessel, its dark metallic interior humming with faint golden energy. Despite the chaos raging across the planet, she stood unmoved, unshaken. Her armor gleamed under artificial lights, obsidian plating lined with veins of gold, every intricate detail woven with the unmistakable elegance of Salarian royalty. The soft glow of her battle regalia gave her an air of both regality and defiance. Then she spoke. Her voice rang through the command center, sharp, unwavering, absolute. I demand asylum for myself and my child. Silence. The weight of her words slammed into the room like a physical force. Murmurs rippled through the human officers. Disbelief. Suspicion. Unease. Some instinctively reached for their weapons, while others exchanged wide-eyed glances. A royal heir of the Salarian Empire, seeking sanctuary among humans. The very idea was unthinkable. Before anyone could react, a thunderous roar erupted through the speakers. The holographic feed shuddered violently, distorted by raw fury. Then another figure appeared. High Commander Pyrrhus. His monstrous form loomed in the transmission, his face a twisted mask of rage. His ashen skin stretched taut, battle scars etched like deep canyons across his ridged brow. His glowing crimson eyes burned with unholy fire. He slammed a clawed fist against the console in front of him. The force of the impact sent a burst of static across the transmission. "You have betrayed us, Aurelia." His voice was a thunderous growl, seething with venom and betrayal. "You, the last daughter of the Salarian throne, have tainted our sacred bloodline." His breath came in heavy, snarling bursts. "You and that alien filth will burn for this." The room held its breath. Then Will stepped forward. His jaw was set. His stance unyielding. The glow from the holographic projection cast hard shadows across his face, making the steel in his gaze even sharper. He stared directly into Pyrrhus's burning eyes, unblinking, unwavering. When he spoke, his voice was calm but lethal. "She made her own choice, Pyrrhus." The words cut through the charged air like a blade. "Not you. Not your empire. And if you think you can stop her," Will's eyes narrowed, his tone dropping into something dangerously quiet. "Then come and try." The tension in the room was electric, suffocating. The way Will, Aurelia, and Pyrrhus locked eyes, three unrelenting forces colliding in an invisible war of will, felt like the spark before an unstoppable explosion. A storm was gathering. And there was no stopping it now. The first shot of war had already been fired. The command room was a pressure chamber, filled with the boiling tension of disbelief and impending war. Will pivoted sharply, his boots grinding against the steel floor. His voice cut through the thick air like a blade, sharp, unwavering. "That child is mine. And I will protect it along with its mother." Silence. Then, a few muffled scoffs. Some officers exchanged uncertain glances, their faces twisted in skepticism. Others shifted uneasily, weighing the gravity of what Will had just declared. But he didn't waver. His gaze burned as it swept across the room, a silent demand for loyalty. His jaw was locked, fists clenched. The sheer force of his presence alone was enough to quell the murmurs. On the flickering holographic screen, Aurelia remained stoic, but her lips curled ever so slightly, a knowing smile, a glint of approval, maybe even admiration. Then, a sudden, deafening alarm shattered the moment. The outpost's warning klaxons screamed through the command center, a shrill, piercing cry of imminent danger. A soldier, hunched over a holographic battle map, snapped his head up. His face was pale, drenched in cold sweat. "We've got incoming. Salarian assault ships breaking through the perimeter." The room erupted into chaos. Officers barked orders, scrambling for weapons. Tactical screens flickered wildly as enemy formations closed in like a tightening noose. Will whipped around, his eyes locking onto the live battle feed. The sky had turned into a maelstrom of fire and destruction. Massive Salarian warships, their sleek, obsidian hulls shimmering ominously under the alien sun, descended like predatory wraiths. From their underbellies, streaks of blinding plasma fire rained down, shredding defensive turrets and watchtowers in explosive bursts of flame and metal. The ground shuddered violently. The shock waves ripped through the camp, throwing soldiers off their feet, sending equipment tumbling. Flames erupted from impact sites, casting eerie shadows against the battered walls. Outside the fortified perimeter, Aurelia's loyalists counterattacked. Their agile, silver-lined warships streaked through the battlefield, green energy bolts crackling like living lightning. The air roared as enemy fighters and Aurelia's forces weaved through each other in a deadly aerial ballet dodge, strike, kill. Will didn't hesitate. He lunged for the weapons rack, his fingers wrapping around the grip of his plasma rifle. The moment his hands made contact, the weapon hummed to life, its core pulsing with barely contained power. His heart thundered in his chest, not with fear, but with unrelenting resolve. This was it. The war had begun. His voice cut through the storm of explosions. Move out. Defend the gates. The outpost erupted into action. Soldiers scrambled into position, rifles primed, shields raised. Heavy artillery cannons swiveled toward the sky, their barrels glowing with the promise of retaliation. Will took one last glance at the flickering holographic screen, at Aurelia, at the chaos unfurling beyond the walls. Then he sprinted straight into the battlefield, plasma rifle raised, his mind locked onto a singular, unshakable purpose. Fight. Protect. Survive. The battlefield was a maelstrom of fire and ice, a place where war met the elements in a violent embrace. Explosions ripped apart the frozen ground, sending jagged shards of ice soaring through the air like daggers. Plasma bolts streaked across the sky, their unnatural green glow casting eerie shadows against the storm-laden clouds. The roar of warships above mixed with the guttural cries of men and Salarian warriors locked in combat. Gunfire, metal, and death, the symphony of battle played at full force. And in the center of it all, Will Watson. His movements were precise, deadly, instinctual. Years of combat experience had shaped him into a soldier who didn't think, he reacted. His plasma rifle hummed hot in his hands, every squeeze of the trigger dropping another target. A Salarian drone streaked overhead, its sleek form scything through the smoke, targeting a cluster of human soldiers. Will fired. A single, well-placed shot pierced its core, sending the machine spiraling down in a smoking heap. East flank, focus fire on that warship. Bring it down, he barked into his comm, his voice cutting through the chaos like a commander born for this moment. Behind him, human soldiers rallied, taking cover behind makeshift barricades of wreckage and frozen debris. They unleashed hell upon the advancing enemy, their weapons blazing. Above them, Aurelia's loyalists battled against Pyrrhix's forces in a deadly aerial dogfight. Sleek, silver ships twisted and rolled through the sky, evading streaks of enemy plasma. Explosions bloomed like fire flowers, raining shrapnel onto the frozen plains below. Then a flicker of movement from the ridge above. Will's instincts screamed. He snapped his head up, scanning the battlefield. And then he saw her. Aurelia stood on a frozen outcrop, a figure of impossible grace amid the carnage. Her silver armor gleamed, reflecting the glow of fire and plasma. But it wasn't just her presence that held him captive. It was her body. Her hands clutched her abdomen, her fingers pressing against the straining plates of her armor. Will's breath hitched. It was impossible. Mere hours ago, she had only shown the first signs of pregnancy. Now her stomach had swollen beyond natural proportions, a clear, undeniable sign of unnatural acceleration. The plates of her armor strained against the growth, almost warping under the pressure. A tremor of awe and dread rippled through Will's mind. Aurelia activated her calm, her voice cutting through the chaos. "This child is our future." Her words weren't just spoken, they resonated. For a split second, the battlefield stilled. Even Pyrrhix's warriors hesitated, their weapons lowering slightly, as if some ancient force had commanded them to listen. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. Will felt his chest tighten. Something was happening. Something far beyond their understanding. Something powerful. Something inevitable. And for the first time in his life, Will Watson, the fearless pilot, the warrior, the survivor, felt destiny whisper his name. The battlefield had not fallen silent, it had merely paused. Smoke still coiled in the freezing air, a ghostly reminder of the carnage that had unfolded moments before. The metallic scent of blood and scorched armor mingled with the icy wind, and distant fires flickered like dying embers, painting the snow in ominous shades of orange and crimson. It was not peace. It was the eye of the storm. Then a new light emerged. Aurelia stepped forward, her every movement radiating purpose, power, and something beyond mortal comprehension. A golden aura pulsed from her skin, rippling outward like the tides of a new dawn, pushing back the lingering haze of war. Her silver armor, still cracked from battle, glowed as if reforged by celestial fire. She was no longer just a queen. She was a force of nature. Her voice, when it came, carried through the battlefield like a prophecy etched in the very fabric of reality. We must change. We must evolve. Her words crashed into the hearts of those who listened. The Salarian warriors, once so consumed by duty, by war, hesitated. Their weapons stained with the blood of humans lowered slightly, as if some deep, forgotten part of their genetic memory stirred in recognition. The human soldiers, battered, bleeding, but still standing, turned their eyes to her, their expressions shifting from confusion to something akin to awe. Even the storm that had raged in the skies began to part, peeling away just enough to reveal the twin suns of this alien world, casting their light upon the battlefield. For a single, fragile moment hope existed. Then the shot rang out. A streak of plasma, fast as lightning, silent as death, tore through the air. A sniper. Hidden among the distant cliffs. Its target Aurelia. Will moved before he could think. His instincts, those same instincts that had kept him alive through battles that should have killed him, took over. He lunged, throwing himself in front of her, an unbreakable shield between the mother of his child and certain death. The plasma round slammed into his armored shoulder. Pain-searing, blinding, all-consuming pain exploded through his body. The force of the impact drove him to one knee, his breath catching in his throat as the scent of burning flesh and molten metal filled his lungs. He barely registered the shouts of soldiers scrambling around him. Through the blur of agony, he felt Aurelia's trembling hand brush against his face. Her golden eyes widened, not with fear, but with something far greater. It was happening. Her body convulsed, a raw energy crackling around her, making the air itself tremble. The child was coming. Now. Will gritted his teeth, forcing himself upright despite the pain. His vision swam, but he could still see the medics rushing toward them. "Get her to the medbay. Now," he roared, his voice thick with pain but unyielding. They obeyed instantly. Aurelia was lifted onto a hovering stretcher, but her body arched violently, the sheer power radiating from within her making the air around her distort. Her breathing came in rapid, shuddering gasps, her skin glowing brighter by the second. This was no ordinary birth. This was something unprecedented, something cosmic, something divine. As they carried her away, Will turned back to the battlefield. His shoulder burned, his blood dripped onto the snow, but he didn't care. The enemy was still out there. And he would not let them take her. Not her. Not the child. Not their future. The temporary medical ward, a makeshift sanctuary of advanced surgical pods and flickering monitors, was drowning in tension. Outside, the war raged on, explosions pounding against the frozen earth, plasma fire streaking through the night like falling stars. But inside this fragile space, another battle was unfolding, one that would decide the fate of two species. Aurelia lay on the medical bed, her body racked with labor pains, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Sweat glistened on her skin, mixing with the smears of battle still clinging to her armor. Her hands gripped the metal frame as another wave of raw, primal agony tore through her. Her body wasn't just giving birth, it was channeling power, a force too great to be contained. Then the light came. A violent swirl of gold and green energy erupted from her, spiraling outward like a living storm. The room shook, monitors flickered wildly, and the very air crackled with an unnatural charge. The medics staggered back, shielding their eyes as reality itself seemed to bend and twist around Aurelia. And then, the child was born. A single, piercing cry rang through the tent. For a moment, time stood still. The infant lay in the arms of a stunned medic, small, fragile, but undeniably powerful. Its golden eyes wide, unblinking, aware, seemed to drink in the world with a depth no newborn should possess. Its light brown hair, still damp, clung to its delicate forehead, a clear reminder of its human heritage. But its skin glowed faintly with an ethereal shimmer, its tiny fingers curling with the raw energy of something new, something never before seen in the universe. Will took an unsteady step forward, his chest tight with something he had never felt before. This was his child. The first of its kind. Then the world shattered. The entrance exploded inward as a towering shadow filled the frame. Pyrrhus. He stormed into the tent, his hulking figure silhouetted against the hellscape of war behind him. Fire and smoke swirled around his form, his every step cracking the floor beneath him. His crimson energy blade ignited a jagged, burning edge of raw destruction. I will end this abomination. His voice was a thunderclap, filled with unrelenting fury. The medics scrambled away, shielding the child in terror. Aurelia, though weakened, bloodied, and barely able to move, still found the strength to act. With trembling fingers, she reached into her suit. The emerald green crystal, the same one she had once entrusted to Will, gleamed faintly in her grasp. She thrust it toward him. "Stop him," she whispered, her golden eyes locking onto Will's, filled with unwavering trust. Will's fingers closed around the crystal. The instant his skin touched it, a pulse of energy surged through his body. His breath hitched. Power, ancient, raw, undeniable, flooded his veins, igniting something deep within him. His grip tightened. His body moved before his mind could process what was happening. As Pyrrhus lunged forward, Will met him halfway. A collision of steel, fire, and destiny. The temporary medical tent was no longer a place of healing. It had become a war zone. Will and Pyrrhus clashed like titans, their weapons searing through the air, each strike a deadly arc of light and fire. Will's plasma blade, a weapon forged from human ingenuity and Salarian technology, met Pyrrhus's crimson energy sword in a blinding collision. Sparks erupted like dying stars, showering the room in flickering embers. The sheer force of their attacks rippled through the walls, making the medical monitors flicker violently. Pyrrhus attacked with relentless fury, his raw strength turning every strike into a devastating blow. His blade whistled downward in a brutal arc, aimed straight for Will's head. "You are not worthy of her," Pyrrhus bellowed, his deep voice shaking the air. Will barely dodged. The plasma blade missed by inches, slicing through a medical console instead. The machine exploded in a burst of blue sparks, casting eerie shadows across the tent. Will didn't hesitate. He lunged. His fist slammed into Pyrrhus's chest, a direct hit. The massive Salarian stumbled back, his armored boots skidding across the metal floor. "She thinks differently," Will shot back, his voice firm, unwavering. Pyrrhus snarled in response, his fiery gaze filled with pure, undying rage. He launched forward again, his energy sword twisting through the air, coming straight for Will's heart. But then, a sound pierced through the battle. A single, unearthly wail. The child's cry. It wasn't just a sound, it was a force. A pulse of golden-green energy exploded outward from the newborn, warping the air itself. The entire room shook violently. Metal tables toppled over. Medics shielded their eyes. Screens and instruments short-circuited. The fabric of reality seemed to bend, as if the very universe had paused to witness this moment. And Pyrrhus, the war-hardened commander, the unbreakable warrior, fell to his knees. His sword slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor. His breathing was ragged, his massive form buckling under the unseen weight of the child's energy. His eyes, once filled with fury, were now filled with something else. Not fear. Not anger. But realization. Aurelia, weakened but standing tall, stepped forward. She held the child close, its tiny form still radiating a soft, golden glow. The energy had calmed, no longer a storm, but a warm beacon pulsing with quiet, undeniable power. The child's golden eyes met Pyrrhus's. They did not blink. They did not waver. They simply watched, as if seeing straight into his soul. Aurelia's voice, though soft, cut through the silence like a blade. "Accept change," she commanded, her tone unshakable, absolute. "Or be forgotten." For the first time, Pyrrhus did not fight. He lowered his head, his great shoulders rising and falling with the weight of history itself. A new era had begun. The winds of change swept across the icy ridge, carrying the distant echoes of battle. Will stood beside Aurelia, their fingers intertwined, their eyes locked onto the valley below. What had once been a chaotic war camp, littered with burning wreckage and the cries of the wounded, had begun to shift into something new. Something fragile. Something hopeful. Down below, human and Salarian soldiers moved side by side, a sight that would have been unthinkable mere days ago. They worked shoulder to shoulder, reinforcing perimeter defenses not against each other, but for a shared tomorrow. Fires no longer consumed broken warships. Instead, small controlled flames crackled in makeshift camps, where former enemies sat together, breaking bread in cautious silence. Some still watched each other with lingering distrust, hands resting near weapons. Old scars did not fade overnight. But beneath the tension, beneath the hesitation, something new had taken root. Unity. Aurelia held the child close. The newborn's golden eyes shimmered, tiny pulses of energy flickering from its irises like distant stars winking in and out of existence. It was not just an infant, it was a bridge between two worlds, a living testament to the impossible future now unfolding before them. Will turned to Aurelia, his voice low, filled with quiet wonder. "We did it?" She looked up at him, the battle-hardened warrior now standing with no armor, no weapons, only truth and purpose. "And we will continue." Her words were a promise. A vow that neither of them would allow this moment, this fragile peace, to be shattered. But ahead lay the greatest challenge yet. The diplomatic summit where humans and Salarians would face each other not as enemies, but as equals. It would be a battlefield of words instead of weapons, of alliances instead of war, but no less dangerous. Suspicion would linger. Old wounds would fester. There would be those who sought to sabotage everything they had fought for. And yet there was no turning back now. Will gazed at the child in Aurelia's arms. In the soft glow of its golden light, he saw the first flickers of a new era. War had shaped them. But the future, the real future, had already begun. The grand hall of Concordia stood like a crystalline colossus amidst the frozen landscape. Its transparent walls, forged from Salarian-infused alloys, allowed the howling blizzard outside to bear silent witness to history in the making. Artificial sunlight bathed the chamber, casting long shadows across the gleaming obsidian floor. At the heart of the hall, a massive metallic table stretched the length of the chamber, its surface so polished it reflected the faces of those seated around it. Humans and Salarians sat across from each other, their expressions carefully measured. Centuries of war and distrust compressed into the tense silence that hovered like a storm cloud above them. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of everything this moment represented. Then, the doors parted. Aurelia and Will stepped inside. The hushed murmurs died instantly. Every pair of eyes turned toward them not in fear, but in something deeper. Curiosity. Uncertainty. The fragile hope of a species teetering on the edge of change. Aurelia walked forward with unshaken grace, her armor absent for the first time in years. Instead, she wore the ceremonial robes of her ancestors, a flowing silver mantle embroidered with celestial constellations, a mark of her lineage as a queen of Salarian blood. In her arms, the child stirred. Its golden irises flickered like distant suns, reflecting the soft glow of the chamber's artificial light. Not just a child. A symbol. A living testament that two species once mortal enemies could be something more than reluctant allies. Will felt his heart tighten in his chest. He had been a soldier for so long that he had forgotten what peace could even look like. And yet here it was, cradled in Aurelia's arms. But then, from the opposite side of the hall, others stepped forward. First, a human man with a Salarian woman beside him. Then, a Salarian male with a human wife at his side. And in their arms children. Children like his. Children with hybrid features, some with Salarian crests adorning their heads, others with human hands but Salarian eyes burning with intelligence far beyond their years. Will's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about him and Aurelia. This had already begun. A hush fell over the chamber. Then, a slow movement. A high-ranking Salarian ambassador rose from his seat. His weathered, reptilian features bore the scars of age and experience, his deep-set eyes studying the child in Aurelia's arms before drifting to the others. For the longest moment, he said nothing. Then he sighed. And with it, something shifted. Perhaps, he spoke at last, his voice steady yet burdened with the weight of an entire civilization's history. Our battle was never truly against each other, but against the fear of what we did not understand. A ripple of acknowledgement swept through the chamber. Heads nodded slowly, some out of agreement, others in quiet resignation. Suspicion gave way to contemplation. The unspoken tension, the wall of distrust that had loomed over their species for generations, began to fracture. Will exhaled, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He turned to Aurelia, his voice low, laced with that familiar warmth. I'd say we make a decent team. She glanced at him, golden eyes glowing softly, and for the first time in a long while, he saw something in them that was neither battle-hardened steel nor unyielding duty. He saw peace. Her fingers tightened around his hand, and as he looked into her eyes, he realized something. For the first time in his life, the war was truly over. The Odyssey glided through the vast ocean of space, its sleek hull reflecting the cold glow of distant stars. The once battered warship had been reforged not just with metal and circuitry, but with purpose. Its engines thrummed with renewed strength, sending soft vibrations through the decks as it carved a path through the infinite void. It was no longer just a vessel. It was home. Will stood on the command bridge, his hands resting lightly on the reinforced railing, eyes locked on the endless stretch of the cosmos. The void stared back, vast and unknowable. No matter how many battles he had fought, no matter how much he had seen, space never failed to humble him. So many stars. So many possibilities. A soft rustle behind him. A presence he would recognize anywhere. Aurelia. She stepped beside him, the faint luminescence of her golden eyes reflected in the bridge's panoramic window. They didn't need words. They simply stood there, shoulders almost touching, gazing out into eternity. And between them their child. No longer an infant. The young being stood tall and poised, an unmistakable aura of quiet power emanating from their small frame. Their golden irises shimmered like molten light, flickering subtly as if mirroring the pulsars in the distance. Their hair, a deep mix of human brown and Salarian silver, framed a face that was both familiar and alien. They had no name for what their child was. Not entirely human. Not entirely Salarian. Something new. Something beyond both. A sudden movement. The child raised a hand. And for a fleeting moment the stars flickered. Not just a trick of the eye. Not an illusion. For the briefest instant, the galaxies outside dimmed and pulsed as if responding to the child's presence. Will's stomach tightened. Aurelia's breath hitched. They had witnessed the child's abilities before, but not like this. This wasn't just an extension of Salarian energy manipulation, nor was it something purely human in nature. This was something else entirely. Something the universe had never seen before. Aurelia was the first to speak, her voice quiet but edged with the weight of prophecy. The universe will fear them. Will smirked, the tension in his shoulders easing just slightly. His voice, though light, carried an unwavering certainty. Then we'll teach the universe that fear isn't necessary. Aurelia turned her head toward him, one brow slightly raised, an amused glint in her golden eyes. And if it refuses to learn? Will chuckled, ruffling the child's hair though the faint glow surrounding them made his fingers tingle. Then we'll just have to teach it the hard way. The child tilted their head, studying them both. The flickering energy in their fingertips dimmed, settling into something calmer, more controlled. Their voice, still soft with innocence, carried an undeniable weight. What comes next? A question so simple, yet so immense. Will and Aurelia exchanged a look. What did come next? The Odyssey's thrusters ignited, sending a deep, resonant hum through the ship as it powered forward. Outside, the cosmic expanse stretched endlessly before them, uncharted worlds, civilizations yet to be discovered, dangers lurking beyond imagination. But they weren't afraid. Because whatever the future held, they would face it together. And with that, their journey continued.